Apple Podcast episode focus. Title and description.
The Deep Dive. Monty Python's Flying Circus and the Anatomy of Absurdity.
Join us for a comprehensive deep dive into the creation, controversy, and enduring legacy of Monty Python's Flying Circus. We unpack how 6 university-educated comedians revolutionized British television with stream-of-consciousness sketch comedy. From their battles with BBC censorship and lost sketches to the strange origins of their name and their unlikely connection to Elvis Presley, we explore what made the Pythons tick. Whether you're curious about John Cleese's disdain for the iconic Ministry of Silly Walks, Terry Gilliam's bizarre cutout animations, the groundbreaking ABC network lawsuit that changed copyright law, or how the show accidentally named the Python programming language in your email spam folder, this deep dive is your shortcut to understanding a monumental piece of pop culture history.
Okay, let's unpack this. If you look back at the landscape of late 1960s television, especially in Britain, it was an incredibly rigid environment.
Very formalized.
Right. Highly formalized. You had these light entertainment programs that followed a really strict, almost mathematical formula.
Setup, punchline, bow.
Exactly.
Right.
The setups were polite, the transitions were seamless, and the punchlines arrived exactly when you expected them to.
Right.
And then tearing through that polite veneer like a chainsaw through a velvet curtain comes a completely unkempt man looking like Robinson Crusoe.
Oh, the It's Man.
Yes. Sprinting across a jagged cliff face, running right up to the camera lens to just gasp the word "it's" before immediately being squashed by a giant animated Victorian foot.
Which is just such a jarring image.
Welcome to the world of Monty Python's Flying Circus. I'm so thrilled to dive into this today.
Me too. It's a massive topic.
It really is. We are working from a very comprehensive Wikipedia article today. And we're going to explore the premise, the incredibly fraught production history, the casting dynamics, and the intense censorship controversies.
And of course, the massive cultural footprint of this groundbreaking show, which originally aired from 1969 to 1974.
Our mission today is to extract the fascinating history of how 6 men completely broke the rules of television.
They really did. It's hard to find a comparison for the sheer impact of what they achieved.
Yeah.
We throw around the phrase ahead of their time a lot when discussing vintage media, but this group didn't just anticipate the future of comedy, they essentially engineered an entirely new timeline for it.
They hacked the mainframe of the BBC?
Basically, yeah. They altered the basic atomic structure of what a television show could actually be.
And they created a blueprint for modern comedy that continues to echo in our daily lives. So, speaking directly to you, the listener, whether you are a diehard comedy nerd or maybe someone interested in the history of television broadcasting.
Or just someone who uses the word spam without knowing where it came from.
Right. This deep dive will reveal the fascinating mechanics behind the madness. So, when you look at the sheer magnitude of the Python legacy, what stands out to you the most?
What's fascinating here is that their legacy isn't just about being funny. It's about being fundamentally aggressively disruptive.
Disruptive how?
Well, you have to remember, these were highly educated, brilliant writers. They looked at the architecture of the traditional joke and decided to declare war on it.
They hated punchlines.
Passionately. They viewed the standard punchline as a creative cop-out, just a way to artificially end a scene that had run out of steam. So they embraced a legacy of absolute creative anarchy.
But it wasn't just chaos for the sake of chaos.
Not at all, and that is the crucial part. It was an anarchy that was meticulously planned, rehearsed, and executed. It wasn't just guys goofing off on camera. It was a highly disciplined deconstruction of television itself.
Meticulously planned anarchy. That is the perfect way to frame it.
Thanks.
So let's look at how this circus was actually assembled, because the background of these 6 men tells you a lot about why they were perfectly positioned to deconstruct that system.
Let's get into it.
The core group consists of Graham Chapman, John Cleese, Eric Idle, Terry Jones, Michael Palin, and the lone American of the group, Terry Gilliam.
The animator.
Right. But before they became Monty Python, the 5 British members were all navigating the very upper echelons of the British comedy scene in the 1960s.
And they were crossing paths at these incredibly prestigious university comedy troupes.
Specifically, the Oxford Revue and the Cambridge Footlights.
And that university background, it's the skeleton key to understanding their entire ethos.
Oh, so.
Because Oxford and Cambridge are the absolute bastions of the British establishment. By coming up through those institutions, these guys learned the language, the mannerisms and the subtle hypocrisies of the British upper classes from the inside out.
So they weren't outsiders.
Exactly. They gained the specific intellectual tools required to dismantle upper-class conventions. If you're going to effectively satirize a high court judge, a military general, or a BBC executive, it helps immensely if you've sat in a room with them and understand exactly how they speak and think.
That makes total sense. They weren't outsiders throwing rocks at the castle. They were inside the castle, rearranging the furniture to confuse the king.
That's a great analogy.
During the 60s, they were writing and performing on various radio and TV shows, most notably The Frost Report, hosted by David Frost.
Which was a massive show at the time.
Huge! And this is where their writing partnerships really started to solidify under an incredibly demanding production schedule. And then you have Terry Gilliam, who meets some of them while they're touring the United States.
And eventually, they decide to bring all these different comedic sensibilities together for a new sketch show at the BBC.
And the naming process for this show, it's just spectacular. It perfectly distills their entire philosophy of confusion.
The naming process is almost a sketch in itself.
Right, because at the time, the BBC's head of comedy was a man named Michael Mills.
And he insisted that the word circus be in the title.
Which they hated.
They did, but Mills wanted it because the BBC executives internally referred to these 6 guys wandering around the offices as a literal circus.
And Mills actually wanted to call the show Baron von Tuch's Circus.
Yeah, as a nod to Barry Tuch, the producer who was instrumental in bringing them all together at the network.
But the group hated the idea of just being a circus. They didn't want people tuning in expecting clowns and trapeze artists. So they added the word flying.
And there's a specific reason for that.
Yeah, apparently this was right around the time the novelty song Snoopy versus the Red Baron was a massive radio hit.
Oh, right.
And the real Red Baron's World War I fighter squadron was famously known as the Flying Circus. It gave the title a slightly more militaristic, erratic feel.
Which leads us to the actual name they settled on.
Yes.
Because they wanted something that sounded like a truly terrible, sleazy theatrical agent.
John Cleese suggested the word python because he felt it sounded inherently slimy and slithery.
And then Eric Idle threw in the name Monty.
They later explained that Monty made them laugh because it immediately evoked Lord Montgomery, the legendary, highly respected British general from the Second World War.
So you mash all of that together. A revered World War II military hero, a slithery reptile, and a World War I fighter squadron.
Monty Python's Flying Circus.
It sounds so iconic now, but at the time it was just a random collision of words.
But as much as I love that title, the rejected titles they pitched to the BBC are what really get me.
Oh, they are incredible.
They seriously pitch names like Wither Canada, The Toad Elevating Moment, and my absolute favorite, Owl Stretching Time.
Owl Stretching Time.
Just imagine looking at the TV guide and seeing that Owl Stretching Time is on at 10:30.
It would certainly give you pause. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, those rejected titles reveal exactly what their underlying artistic intent was.
Which was what?
Well, names like Owl Stretching Time or The Toad Elevating Moment are structurally and linguistically coherent. They follow the rules of English grammar, but they are semantically meaningless.
They're anti-titles.
Exactly. The naming process reflected their ultimate goal, which was to be completely and utterly uncategorizable.
Right, because if your show is called The Nose Show, which was another pitch, the audience cannot possibly project their own expectations onto it.
Precisely. They didn't want the audience to have any preconceived notions. If you call a show the Comedy Half Hour, the audience expects traditional jokes.
You're setting a trap for yourself.
Yes. By fighting for a bizarre name, they were actively managing expectations. The fact that several of these rejected titles eventually became the titles of individual episodes later on just proves how deeply committed they were to this specific brand of absurdity.
And then there's the theme song. Now, you would think a show this avant-garde, premiering in 1969 at the height of the counterculture movement, would commission some crazy psychedelic rock track.
Maybe something with a sitar.
Exactly. But no, they chose the Liberty Bell March, a piece composed by John Philip Sousa, specifically the version performed by the Band of the Grenadier Guards.
It's this incredibly pompous, rigid, brass-heavy military march.
Which is brilliant for 2 entirely different reasons, one artistic and one purely logistical.
Let's start with the logistics, because Terry Gilliam chose that specific Sousa march, which was first published back in 1893, for a very practical reason.
It had fallen into the public domain.
Yes.
I always love when high art is dictated by extreme cheapness.
It's a tale as old as time. Because of the Berne Convention, which is an international agreement governing copyright and United States copyright law at the time, the piece was no longer protected.
Meaning it was free.
Completely free. The BBC could use it as the theme music without having to pay a single penny in ongoing royalty payments. It was a completely free asset.
But artistically, it works on a genius level, too.
Absolutely. You have this incredibly self-important militaristic march music blaring, while Gilliam's bizarre, surreal cutout animations squash the title screen.
Like the giant Victorian foot.
Right. The contrast between the ridgy audio and the anarchic visual immediately establishes a tone of mocking the establishment.
It tells the audience right away, we're going to take everything serious and proper, and we're going to step on it.
Literally.
Let's transition into talking about the cast themselves. Because even though the show notoriously avoided using recurring characters in the traditional sitcom sense, each of the 6 Pythons developed and perfected very specific comedic tendencies.
It's almost like they each had a distinct psychological profile they brought to the table.
Let's start with John Cleese. Visually, he stands out immediately because he is 6'5".
He towers over almost everyone else in the frame.
And he utilized that physicality to become the absolute master of the ridiculous authority figure.
Cleese's height naturally gave him a commanding presence, but it was what he did with that presence that was so funny. He specialized in playing intimidating maniacs, highly strung bureaucrats, and foreigners with outrageous, totally incomprehensible accents.
Often French or German.
Yes, he thrived on playing characters who were entirely convinced of their own logic, no matter how deranged that logic was.
The perfect example is Mr. Palin, the disgruntled customer in the legendary Dead Parrot sketch.
Oh, class.
He marches into a pet shop to return a Norwegian blue parrot that is obviously definitively deceased. But he maintains this rigid, hyper-articulate outrage against a shopkeeper who refuses to admit the bird is dead.
It's a masterclass in escalating frustration.
It really is. But the detail that I find so incredibly interesting is about his physical comedy, specifically the Ministry of Silly Walks.
Ah, yes.
Cleese plays this tall, loose-limbed government official in a bowler hat, doing these spectacularly contorted, high-kicking, absurd walks on his daily commute. It is arguably their most famous sketch globally.
Without a doubt.
But Cleese actually disliked doing it. Why would he hate his most famous sketch?
It comes down to his philosophy of what makes comedy worthwhile. Cleese felt that Silly Walks was just cheap slapstick.
Really?
Yeah. Yes, it generated massive, uproarious laughs, but he felt it lacked a true satirical core. To him, the joke wasn't supposed to be, look at the funny man walking weirdly. The joke was supposed to be a biting satire on the bureaucratic uselessness of government ministries. The idea that the government would fund an entire department to develop ridiculous walks.
Ah, so the physical comedy entirely eclipsed the intellectual joke he was trying to make.
Precisely. The visual of his long legs kicking up to his ears was so overwhelmingly funny that nobody cared about the satire of British bureaucracy.
They just wanted to see the walk.
Exactly. He wasn't interested in just falling over or moving funny. He wanted to punch up at the system. It's a classic creative irony. Creators often resent it when the general public latches on to what the creator considers to be their least intellectually rigorous work.
It frustrated him that this piece of physical clowning became his defining image.
It did.
That makes a lot of sense. You want to be known for your brilliant writing, and everyone just wants you to do the funny dance. Okay, moving on to Michael Palin.
The everyman.
According to the other members of the troupe, Palin possessed the widest acting range of the group. He could genuinely disappear into roles. He could play these disgusting, downtrodden, working-class northerners.
Which they utilized brilliantly later in the Every Sperm is Sacred segment of their film, The Meaning of Life.
Yes. But then, in the blink of an eye, he could pivot to playing incredibly slick, smarmy, self-loathing television hosts. Think of the sketch Blackmail, where he plays a game show host who extorts money from the viewing audience on live TV.
And yet he could also dial the energy completely down to play the weak-willed, put-upon everyman. Look at the Argument Clinic sketch.
Oh, that's a great example.
Cleese is the aggressive, contradictory, professional arguer, but the sketch only works because Palin plays the client with such earnest, mild-mannered confusion.
And of course, he's the iconic It's Man we mentioned at the start, bursting through the screen, looking entirely deranged, just to get one word out before the theme music hits.
Palin was essentially the glue of the cast. Because he was naturally so amiable on screen and could play the grounded everyman so convincingly, he anchored the absurdity of the others.
He balanced them out.
Exactly. If Cleese represented towering, apoplectic rage, Palin was the cheerful, sometimes befuddled center that the rage was usually directed at. You need that contrast. If everyone is yelling, it's just noise. Palin provided the quiet baseline that made the loud moments pop.
Next up is Terry Jones. Now, it was standard practice for all the Pythons to dress in drag to play female characters, but Terry Jones was widely considered the absolute best at it.
The absolute best. What they affectionately referred to behind the scenes as the best ratbag woman in the business.
Yes. When a sketch required a screeching, lower-middle-class housewife, Jones was the immediate go-to. They internally called these characters the pepper pots.
Because they thought the silhouette of a typical British housewife that era, bundled up in coats and hats, looked exactly like a table pepper shaker.
Jones's pepper pots were iconic. They were the loudest, the shrillest, and the most utterly disheveled characters on the show. But his contribution went far beyond drag.
Oh, absolutely.
He also played the completely bizarre nude organist who would randomly punctuate sketches with dramatic organ chords. More importantly, though, behind the scenes, Jones was the one pulling a massive amount of the creative strings.
As the show evolved, he essentially took on the role of an uncredited director. He was constantly pushing for better camera angles and more cinematic lighting.
Which really set the stage for him eventually directing their feature films, like Life of Brian.
Right.
But contrasting his shrieking pepperpot housewives with Eric Idle's approach to drag is really interesting.
It highlights the different comedic instincts within the group. When Eric Idle played female characters, he played them much more straightforwardly. He would just alter his voice slightly, adopting a softer cadence rather than doing the full falsetto shrieking that Jones did.
Idle was generally known for playing the cheeky, suggestive playboy.
Most famously, the character in the Nudge Nudge sketch.
Nudge, nudge, wink, wink.
Exactly. The guy who keeps aggressively hinting at sexual innuendo to a completely oblivious man. He excelled at playing slick, crafty salesmen who could talk their way out of anything.
Another crucial detail about Eric Idle is his writing process. Cleese and Chapman wrote as a duo. Jones and Palin wrote as a duo. But Eric Idle was the lone wolf. He wrote entirely by himself.
And he was also the group's undeniable musical genius. He's the one who eventually wrote, "Always look on the bright side of life."
How do you think writing alone impacted his specific comedic voice on the show?
Writing alone gave Idle's sketches a completely different rhythm compared to the rest of the show. When you're writing with a partner, you're constantly batting ideas back and forth in the room, testing the laughs, adjusting the timing. It creates a conversational dynamic.
A natural back and forth.
Right. But because Idle was isolated, his writing became highly structurally complex, particularly in its linguistics.
Lots of wordplay.
Heavy wordplay. His sketches often relied on intricate, rapid-fire monologues. He didn't have a partner to interrupt him, so he would just build these towering edifices of verbal gymnastics. It added a layer of sheer verbal dexterity to the show that contrasted beautifully with the more situational sketches of the other pairings.
Then we have Graham Chapman. Chapman had this brilliant knack for playing the ultimate straight-laced figure.
The bedrock of the sketch.
He was often cast as the pipe-smoking military officer, the stern police inspector, or the serious medical doctor. But his absolute genius was that he could be projecting this aura of total, unshakable authority and then suddenly, without any warning whatsoever, snap into completely maniacal behavior.
And then instantly revert back to his sober, dignified demeanor as if nothing had happened.
Chapman was the ultimate straight man, which is a vastly underappreciated skill in comedy.
To hold a ridiculous premise with absolute, unwavering seriousness is incredibly difficult. You need that grounding when the world around the character is descending into total insanity.
Right. If the doctor reacts to the absurdity, the sketch deflates.
The doctor has to treat the absurdity as mundane. This foundational skill is exactly why they relied on him to play the central, ground-him lead roles in their feature films later on, like King Arthur in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and the title character in Life of Brian. He anchored the narrative so the others could spin out of control around him.
And finally, we have the sixth Python, Terry Gilliam. As we mentioned, he was the animator. He was a guy secluded in a room, creating those surreal, interstitial cutout animations that linked the sketches together.
His process was fascinating.
He would take old Sears robot catalogs, clip out illustrations of Victorian machinery, gears, and gadgets, and mix them with pieces of classic Renaissance art.
Like the iconic giant foot that squashes the title screen.
Yes, That's not just a drawing. It's the actual foot of Cupid, clipped right out of the classic Agnolo Bronzino painting Venus, Cupid, Folly, and Time, which is hanging in the National Gallery in London.
Gilliam's animations were the secret sauce that allowed the entire format of the show to work, which we'll touch on in a moment. But it's also worth noting his on-screen presence.
Because he was American.
Exactly. And because he genuinely struggled to perform the exaggerated, hyper-specific English accents the others were doing, he ended up taking all the grotesque, non-speaking, or heavily makeup-reliant roles that nobody else wanted.
Right. He was the guy in the full suit of armor who would randomly walk onto the set in the middle of a scene, hit someone over the head with a raw, plucked chicken, and walk off.
Or he'd play a man with a stuffed stoat violently shoved through his head.
He was essentially the human embodiment of his own bizarre animations.
When you look at all 6 of these profiles together, this raises a really important point about creative collaboration. What's remarkable is how this extreme specialization allowed the group to avoid redundant writing.
They weren't stepping on each other's toes.
They had distinct, highly specialized comedic weapons at their disposal. If a sketch needed apoplectic, towering rage, they deployed Cleese. If they needed a frantic, sympathetic everyman, they deployed Palin. If they needed a visual non sequitur or pure grotesque weirdness, they deployed Gilliam.
It allowed them to cover a massive spectrum of human absurdity. Which brings us perfectly to Section 3, breaking the mold. Because having diverse talent is one thing, but how they actually structured the show was the true revolution.
They completely broke the mold of how a sketch comedy show was supposed to operate.
Traditionally, a sketch has a beginning, a middle, and an end, culminating in a punchline. The punchline is the release valve for the tension. But the Pythons actively hated punchlines.
They felt that forcing a brilliant, absurd premise to end on a neat, tidy joke often ruined the entire concept.
It was a betrayal of the sketch's internal logic.
It's true. So heavily inspired by Spike Milligan's groundbreaking anarchic comedy show Q, which had aired previously, they decided to abandon the traditional structure entirely. Instead of discrete sketches, they relied on a stream of consciousness flow.
One sketch would just bleed directly into another, often mid-sentence.
And this is where Terry Gilliam's animations were vital. The animations served as the glue. If a sketch had run its course and didn't have an ending, a giant animated mouth would just descend from the sky and eat the actors, and suddenly you were in a new scene.
It's brilliant. And instead of relying on recurring main characters with catchphrases to anchor the show and build a traditional fan base, they relied on recurring interruptions.
They weaponized the disruption itself.
That is a great way to phrase it. If a sketch was dragging, or if they simply couldn't think of a clever way to wrap it up, they would literally have Graham Chapman walk onto the set dressed as a British Army colonel.
And he would march right up to the camera, look directly at the audience and say, "Stop this, it's getting too silly."
And he would officially, as an agent of the military, order the sketch to end.
Or suddenly, the door would fly open and Michael Palin would burst into the room dressed as a flamboyant cardinal, flanked by 2 other cardinals, and he would shout, "Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition," completely derailing whatever scene was happening.
Or you would just cut abruptly to a very proper BBC continuity announcer, played by John Cleese in a tuxedo, sitting at a wooden desk that was inexplicably placed in the middle of a dense forest or a beach. And he would simply say, "And now, for something completely different."
The genius of the Colonel character in particular cannot be overstated when we analyze television history. By writing a character who actively critiques and shuts down the sketch from within the show itself, the Pythons built a meta layer into their comedy that was practically unheard of at the time.
They were preemptively mocking the television critics and the network executives.
If a viewer sitting at home was thinking, well, this is getting stupid, the show beat them to the punch by having an authority figure step in and declare it stupid. It completely disarmed the traditional dynamic between the television program and the audience. It made the viewer complicit in the deconstruction.
And it wasn't just abstract concepts of authority they were mocking. They aimed their sights squarely at real, contemporary politicians of the era. The sources show they frequently targeted Reginald Maudling, who was a very prominent conservative politician at the time.
They also took aim at the Secretary of State for Education and Science, a woman who would later become a highly polarizing prime minister, Margaret Thatcher.
They spoofed the Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister Edward Heath. They even broadened their scope internationally and went after U.S. President Richard Nixon.
Now, when we analyze these targets, what becomes clear, and we should be very explicit about this for the listener, is that The Pythons weren't operating as a partisan political action committee.
Yes, absolutely. We are just relaying the targets mentioned in our source material. We are not taking any political sides here or endorsing these viewpoints.
Completely neutral reporting on our end. And the source material shows their targeting of these figures reflected a much broader, general anti-establishment ethos rather than partisan endorsement.
Exactly. They were equal opportunity offenders when it came to the establishment. They went after the British police force, the military brass, the Anglican Church, the legal system, and even the BBC executives who were paying their salaries.
Anyone who wielded power, authority, or demanded unearned respect was considered fair game for ridicule. It was less about left versus right and more about anti-authoritarianism.
And that approach naturally leads us to how the ultimate establishment, specifically the hierarchy of the BBC, reacted to this absolute madness airing on their network. Because the battles between the Pythons and the BBC executives are legendary.
Oh, they are incredible. Let's get into those BBC battles, because the initial reception of the show was basically a disaster.
The very first episode of Monty Python's Flying Circus was broadcast on a Sunday evening, October 5th, 1969, at 10:55 p.m. And to say it didn't land well is the understatement of the century.
It captured only about 3% of the total UK television watching population. That's roughly 1.5 million people.
To put that in perspective, another very traditional comedy show airing that same week, Dad's Army, pulled in 22% of the population. But the raw viewership numbers weren't even the worst part.
No, the real crisis came from the BBC's internal metrics. The BBC used something called an appreciation index. This wasn't just a measure of how many television sets were tuned in. It was a qualitative score out of 100 based on audience surveys to gauge if people actually liked, understood, and appreciated what they were watching.
And how did Python do on the appreciation index?
It earned the lowest appreciation index score in the entire history of the BBC's light entertainment programming. People didn't just change the channel. The people who stayed to watch actively hated it. Internal BBC memos and documents from executives at the time actually described the program as disgusting and nihilistic.
Disgusting and nihilistic.
They viewed it as an assault on the sensibilities of the British public.
If you achieve the lowest audience appreciation score in the history of a major national broadcasting network, how do you keep your job? Does that just mean you completely failed at making comedy?
Well, this raises an important question about the nature of true innovation. If you score a 0 on an established metric, does it mean you failed? Or does it mean the metric itself is incapable of measuring what you've created?
I'd say the latter.
I would argue it's the latter, too. They made something so radically new, so entirely divorced from the established language of television, that the audience literally didn't possess the mental tools to process it yet. They were speaking a comedic language that hadn't been invented until that exact moment.
You can't appreciate a joke if you don't even realize a joke is being told.
It took time to teach the audience how to watch the show.
And while the audience was struggling to figure it out, the chaos was raging behind the scenes, too. John Cleese almost didn't even participate in the show initially because he was under a strict contract with David Frost's production company.
And the Pythons, being the anarchists they were, decided to get back at David Frost for his tight grip on their careers.
In the second episode of the series, during a sketch called The Mouse Problem, they actually slipped David Frost's real personal phone number onto the screen.
Which is just a phenomenally reckless prank for 1969.
Viewers actually called the number and harassed him endlessly. And the BBC executives panicked and had to scramble to force a re-edit of the episode to remove the number before it aired again.
And that prank was really just the opening skirmish in what would become a protracted war of censorship. As the show progressed through its seasons and began to build a massive, devoted cult following, particularly among young people, the BBC executives started paying much closer attention to the content, and they really did not like what they saw.
Not at all. There are several famous, lost, or heavily censored sketches that illustrate just how tense the relationship got. For example, in a highly intellectual sketch about summarizing the works of Marcel Proust, the BBC forced them to cut the word masturbating.
In another famous sketch about a travel agent, Eric Idle plays a character with a severe speech impediment who consistently pronounces the letter C as a B. The BBC completely excised the line where he says, "What a silly bunt," because the phonetic implication was too much for them to handle.
And it wasn't just dialogue they were cutting. They were pulling entire concepts. The network totally removed the Undertaker sketch from all repeat broadcasts.
In that sketch, A man goes to an undertaker to dispose of his dead mother, and the undertakers casually suggest eating her.
The comedic references to necro-cannibalism were deemed a bridge too far for the viewing public. The tension between the creators and the network was palpable. The show's producer, Ian McNaughton, was repeatedly called into meetings and severely reprimanded by BBC executives for not alerting them beforehand to the content of sketches like The Undertakers or another sketch that blatantly mocked the UK national anthem.
It reached a boiling point where Michael Palin noted in his personal diary that the BBC was actively, aggressively starting to censor the program during its third series. They felt their creative freedom was being strangled.
And the tragedy of this era of television is that because of the way archiving worked, which is to say, it barely worked at all, some of this censored or cut material was considered lost forever. The BBC routinely wiped their master videotapes to save money and reused the expensive magnetic tape for new programs.
They didn't view these shows as historical artifacts. They viewed them as disposable entertainment.
But history has a funny way of surviving. Years later, some incredible discoveries were made by the fans themselves. There was a legendary sketch called the Choreographed Party Political Broadcast. In it, John Cleese plays a very stiff Conservative Party spokesman who is attempting to deliver a serious political speech, but he continuously breaks out into ballet dancing, being aggressively coached by a flamboyant choreographer played by Eric Idle.
Because the BBC's tape-wiping policy, it was deemed completely lost to time. But in 2008, a home-recorded tape of this exact sketch miraculously turned up on YouTube.
And where did it come from? It had been captured by a dedicated fan off a television broadcast on a PBS outlet, WNED-TV, all the way over in Buffalo, New York.
It's a truly incredible story of grassroots media preservation. The fans essentially saved the cultural history that the network actively tried to erase, whether that erasure was through deliberate censorship or just sheer corporate negligence.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. You mentioned that Buffalo, New York PBS station. That perfectly pivots us to Section 5, going global. Because taking this incredibly specific, incredibly British, entirely weird show across the Atlantic to an American audience was not a smooth process.
This is a massive uphill battle.
Initially, Time Life Television, which handled the distribution of BBC shows in America, took one look at Monty Python and gave it a hard pass. They said, no way. This is way too British. The references are too local. The pacing is too strange. Americans will never, ever understand this.
And for a brief, agonizing moment, Time Life was proven absolutely right. During the Python's first major North American promotional tour in 1973, their management booked them an appearance on live U.S. television. They were slated to perform on The Tonight Show, which was being guest hosted by the comedian Joey Bishop at the time. This was supposed to be their big introduction to the American public.
And it was an unmitigated catastrophe. Eric Idle has described the experience in vivid detail. They went out and performed 15 minutes of their best, most tested material for the studio audience, and they received 0 laughs.
Not a polite chuckle. Not a titter.
Absolute dead silence in Burbank, California. Idle said they were so shell-shocked by the failure that they literally ran out onto the grass outside the studio after the segment and just lay down and laughed hysterically for 15 minutes because the failure was so monumental.
The American audience genuinely had no earthly idea what they were looking at. It was like they were performing in Martian.
But the breakthrough didn't happen through the traditional mainstream late-night networks. It came through an entirely different, far more grassroots avenue of American television, public broadcasting.
Their American manager, Nancy Lewis, tirelessly pushed the show, refusing to accept defeat. Finally, in 1974, a PBS member station in Dallas, Texas, took a massive risk and became the first U.S. station to broadcast full episodes of The Flying Circus.
Dallas, Texas.
Yeah.
Of all places. And it caught on like wildfire.
It did. It resonated deeply with a specific demographic. A younger, college-educated audience who were actively looking for countercultural entertainment that didn't talk down to them. The absurdity matched the general disillusionment of the 1970s. By 1975, thanks to the syndication network, it was often the most popular show on PBS stations across the entire country.
But with massive American popularity comes massive American corporate interference. The major networks suddenly smelled money. The ABC network saw how huge it was getting on public television and bought the rights to show select episodes on their wide world of entertainment late-night showcase.
But ABC didn't just take the BBC tapes and air them, they heavily re-edited them.
They'd chop the episodes into pieces to forcefully insert commercial breaks. which, as we discussed earlier regarding their stream of consciousness structure, completely destroyed the delicate flow that the pythons had so carefully designed.
You can't put a soap commercial in the middle of a sketch that relies on unbroken momentum.
The pythons were absolutely furious. So what did they do? 6 comedians sued one of the largest broadcasting networks in America.
And this lawsuit is a monumental watershed moment in the history of entertainment law and copyright. When they sued ABC, initially, a lower court judge agreed that their artistic rights had technically been violated by the crude editing, but the judge refused to grant an injunction to stop ABC from airing the butchered episodes.
The network thought they had won.
But the pythons didn't back down. They appealed the decision. And they won a landmark appellate ruling that gave them complete control over all subsequent U.S. broadcasts of their programs.
But from a legal standpoint, didn't ABC buy the broadcasting rights? Why wasn't the network allowed to edit the content they paid for?
That is the crux of why this case is so vital. The ruling established a powerful legal precedent for moral rights for artists in television. Moral rights are distinct from economic copyright. It's the legal idea that a creator has an inherent right to protect the integrity of their work from being mutilated, distorted, or fundamentally altered by a distributor, even if that distributor has paid for the broadcast rights.
Wow.
The court ruled that ABC's edits were so severe that they constituted a mutilation of the artist's original intent. And furthermore, this grueling legal battle gave the pythons the leverage they needed to eventually gain control of their own physical master types from the BBC once their original contracts expired. They literally wrestled their intellectual property away from the corporate giants.
Which is incredible.
Yeah.
They fought the law, and the weirdos won. And once they had that control, their global reach just kept expanding in the most bizarre ways. I mean, they went to Germany in 1971 and 1972 and actually produced 2 special, brand new German episodes titled Monty Python's Fliegender Circus.
For the first one, they actually memorized and performed their lines in German phonetically.
Can you imagine John Cleese shouting his apoplectic rages in phonetic German? It's mind-boggling. And decades later, they even supported a 2005 French theatrical adaptation of their sketches. Though the translations in the French version were interesting. Let's just say the famous song Sit on My Face was translated into something so incredibly anatomically explicit in French that we definitely cannot translate it back to English on this deep dive.
It just proves that the core mechanics of their comedy, the disruption of logic, the mockery of authority, the embrace of the surreal, translates across almost all cultural and linguistic barriers. Even if the specific political or cultural references have to change, nonsense is a universal language.
But of all the people across the globe who fell in love with this show and spoke that language of nonsense, there's one fan mentioned in the history books that just absolutely blows my mind. Elvis Presley.
The king of rock and roll.
Yes. According to his cousin Billy Smith, during the final tragic months of Elvis's life in 1977, when he was mostly confined to his bedroom in Graceland, heavily isolated and struggling with his health and addiction, he would sit for hours and hours just endlessly chatting with his cousin about his absolute favorite Monty Python sketches.
Just visualize that scene for a second. The cloistered king of rock and roll in the deep heart of Memphis, Tennessee, sitting in a lavish, heavily draped bedroom, analyzing British sketch comedy about dead parrots and silly walks.
It is a surreal image that I think Terry Gilliam himself would be proud to animate.
It is deeply surreal, almost incredibly sad in a way, but it also speaks to the absolute universal appeal of the absurd. When the pressures of the real world or the crushing pressures of immense, unprecedented global fame, in Elvis's case, become too much to bear, the pure, unadulterated nonsense of Python provides a very specific kind of psychological relief. It's a reminder that nothing is really that serious. It offers an escape into a world where the rules don't apply.
That is a genuinely beautiful way to look at it. Let's move into our final section, the enduring legacy. Because for a show that changed the world, the Flying Circus didn't actually last that long. John Cleese actually chose to leave the show after the 3rd series.
He felt the material was getting repetitive, that they were starting to repeat their own formulas, and he was finding it increasingly difficult to work with his writing partner, Graham Chapman, who was struggling severely with alcoholism at the time, which made the writing process erratic.
The remaining Pythons did go on to produce a shortened 4th series without Cleese, but they ultimately decided to end the show prematurely. The final episode was broadcast on December 5th, 1974. Only 45 episodes were ever made.
45 episodes. That is a remarkably small output for the impact it had. When we look at the legacy, you see the direct DNA of Python in almost everything that followed. Lorne Michaels has explicitly cited Monty Python as a massive foundational influence on the creation of Saturday Night Live.
They paved the way for that kind of late-night subversive television.
Douglas Adams, the legendary author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, actually co-wrote a sketch for that fourth series and famously stated he spent years just wanting to be John Cleese. They influenced the entire rhythm of modern sketch comedy, the embrace of the surreal, and most importantly, the refusal to talk down to an audience.
But the legacy leaps completely out of the limb of comedy and into the real world in the most unexpected ways possible. And if you are listening to this right now on a smartphone, a tablet, or a computer, you are interacting with the legacy of Monty Python.
In the late 1980s, a brilliant computer programmer named Guido van Rossum was creating a new, highly structured programming language. He wanted a name that was short, unique, and slightly mysterious.
He happened to be reading the published scripts from Monty Python's Flying Circus at the exact time he was developing it, so he named the language Python. Today, Python is one of the most widely used coding languages on the entire planet. It powers massive parts of our global digital infrastructure, from search engines to artificial intelligence.
It is truly one of the greatest, most poetic ironies of modern history. You have a television show that was built entirely from the ground up on chaotic absurdism. It was designed to defy logic, to break all the rules, and to celebrate total anarchy. And yet, it ended up providing the naming convention for the highly logical, incredibly rigid, mathematically rule-bound digital infrastructure that runs our entire modern world. It is the ultimate subversive act.
Oh, and it gets better. Think about your email inbox. Think about the folder where all the relentless, unwanted junk goes. The term spam comes directly, 100%, from a Monty Python sketch.
In the sketch, two customers are sitting in a greasy spoon cafe where the menu is read out loud, and almost every single item includes the canned meat spam. Egg and spam, egg, bacon and spam, spam, egg, sausage, and spam.
As the sketch progresses, a choir of Vikings sitting in the cafe starts drowning out all the dialogue by loudly, repetitively singing spam, 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 spam.
Early internet pioneers in the 80s and 90s used the word spamming to describe the act of flooding a chat room, a bulletin board, or an email inbox with repetitive, unwanted junk, drowning out the actual conversation, exactly like the Vikings drowning out the dialogue in the sketch.
It's a literal linguistic virus that leaped off a BBC soundstage in 1970, infected early internet culture, and embedded itself directly into the Oxford English Dictionary and the daily vocabulary of billions of people.
So what does this all mean? Let's synthesize this incredible journey.
We started with 6 guys in 1969 who took the established, polite rules of television and threw them completely out the window. They experimented with stream of consciousness, they eradicated punchlines, they glued it all together with surreal Renaissance art cutouts, and they mocked everyone from the military generals to the BBC executives paying their salaries.
They were deemed disgusting and nihilistic. They earned the lowest appreciation score in the history of the network, and they bombed so hard on American television that they had to lie down in the grass and laugh at their own failure.
And yet, they fought for their creative rights in federal court, they found their audience, and they became a cultural juggernaut. A juggernaut that literally named the code that likely built the podcast app you are using to listen to us right now.
They prove that uncompromising artistic vision, even when it is initially rejected, misunderstood, or despised by the mainstream, has the power to fundamentally reshape the culture. They didn't change their comedy to fit the world. They forced the world to understand their comedy.
Exactly. So, to you listening, whenever you have an idea, whether it's at work, in your creative life, or just a project you're passionate about, and you start to doubt yourself, strike that whenever you feel like your ideas are too weird or too niche or just won't be understood by the people around you, I want you to remember this deep dive.
Remember that Monty Python's Flying Circus was once deemed unwatchable, too strange, and far too British to ever succeed.
Weirdness, when you commit to it fully and execute it with discipline, can literally change the world.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on everything we've unpacked today. The Pythons revolutionized television precisely because they were able to recognize the invisible rules of the medium. The mandatory punchlines, the clean continuity, the polite endings, the respect for authority, and they deliberately chose to break them.
Fast forward to today. What are the invisible, assumed rules of the media we consume right now?
Think about the infinite scroll of TikTok. The algorithm-driven content on streaming platforms, or even the structure of deep dives like this one. There's a rhythm and an expectation we all just blindly accept as normal.
What are those rules, and what would it look like if someone today had the courage to just stop doing them?
Now, that is a brilliant question to end on.
Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration into the anatomy of absurdity. Keep questioning the rules, keep embracing the weird, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.